competition. I'd now like to introduce Betsy McFarland, who's going to talk about effectively engaging volunteers.
Hello again. How's everybody doing? I don't hear any answers. Okay. All right, thank you. I need to make sure I have audience here. Okay. I'm actually really excited about this. This is one of my favorite topics for a lot of reasons. And I'm condensing a lot of information into a short time, so I'm barely going to skim the surface here. But hopefully I can at least give you some framework to think about as you continue to look at how to improve what you're doing for animals in the community. The picture that you see up here is actually, I'm kind of off to the side there, and this was my little corps of volunteers back about almost 20 years ago when I went into a shelter for the first time. And I love this picture because of what it took to get that together. And my first experience going into a shelter was my husband and I got married after college and moved to Texas, which I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Maryland, so going to Texas is like going to a foreign country. And my husband was going to graduate school, and so I was working for the university. And I was really having, not been in my element. I was in a new community. I wanted to meet people. I loved animals, but I also loved children. I loved all kinds of causes. I just wanted to volunteer. So I started looking for volunteer opportunities. I looked at schools. I tried to connect with American Red Cross or the local Red Cross and all these other efforts. And I was finding it really difficult to find volunteer work, believe it or not. Now it's so much better. But I happened upon the animal shelter's website, and they had like this little, back then it was like the little flashing GIF, remember those? That said, we need help, we'll have an orientation one day. So I trucked down to the shelter during my lunch hour. And I'd never, like I said, I'd never been into a shelter before. And this was a high intake shelter. They did animal control. They were in a small building, way too small for their needs. And it was nonprofit run, but contract with the county. So I go in and I go up to the front desk and I say, "Hi, I'm here, here to learn about volunteering." This was the reaction. What? And I was like, I wanted to volunteer. You said you were going to have an orientation. I wanted to learn more about getting involved. I love animals. Well, they're going to do a slideshow in the little conference room right there in about 10 minutes if you want to sit in there. There's a guy in there doing court-ordered community service because he was drunk driving, but you can go in there and watch that. And I was like, okay. I walked in there like good little two shoes, and I watched this ridiculous slideshow, and then I came back out afterwards. I was like, okay, I've watched your slideshow, so now what? I'm like, what do you mean now what? I'm like, how do I actually volunteer with you? And they were like, well, there's like an adoption event this weekend. You could probably come help out with that. So that was my first experience with an animal shelter, and my first experience trying to volunteer. And for some crazy reason, I went to this outreach event, or to the adoption event, and because I was blown away by what I saw in the shelter, and I just thought, good Lord, these people need help, and good Lord, the community could do something about this. I thought, well, let me just see what I can do, and I just started volunteering with them, and I kept at it for several months, almost as an experiment for myself, because I thought, well, let me just see how this goes, and maybe I can help them somehow. And I have to admit, it was not always easy, and and the staff either ignored me or sometimes, frankly, were pretty rude. But over time, I won their trust, and I noticed that they started to treat me different. I mean, at first, I was doing all the grunt work you could think of. They would be like, here, clean this nasty trap that we trapped a raccoon in yesterday. Yes, I'll do it. And I kind of earned their trust, and then once I got their trust, I said, I sat down with the operations director and just said, can I help? Like, I have some ideas here, and I'd never done this before, and they were like, well, sure. So long story short, I started putting together pieces, calling every shelter I could think of across the country to get some information. And now it's so much easier, frankly, because everything's online. 20 years ago, most of you know, there was not much online, so I had to make a lot of phone calls and have people mail me packets. But I was able to put together a pretty basic program, but I ran it for a couple of years as a volunteer before I was fortunate to get hired by the HSUS. And some of my proudest moments were finally seeing that they had this amazing revolving door of people coming through the facility. Like, as I was kind of being the consistent one and earning their trust, I watched volunteer after volunteer come in and never see them again. And I thought, we got to change this. And so this picture for me is proud, and I want to be able to, after that experience and coming to HSUS, I was given an opportunity to do a lot more work on this issue. So I wrote a book for the organization, and I've done a lot of trainings around it. And I published some research that I want to talk about today about volunteer and employee interactions that I think can help you in their efforts. We also have, in the last 4 years, developed a national volunteer program at the Humane Society of the United States, where I am now, which we didn't have when I started. I was really excited to be able to take the lead on initiating that effort and hiring the folks who are now doing that for us. So volunteers is near and dear to my heart, as you can see. All right, so now into the nitty-gritty of how some of this stuff can work. At what point does a volunteer program really become a volunteer program? In my view, it's when you have more than one person volunteering for you. Then you've got a program, because even if it's small, you need to have a roadmap and some kind of basic fundamentals in order to be sure you're supporting the people who are trying to help you and to support your staff. Otherwise, it's like this, right? Herding cats. It's no fun, and it can quickly become a problem. How many of you have perfect volunteer programs and never have had a volunteer problem ever? Okay, that's what I thought. So why, given that, that you don't have these perfect volunteer programs, why do you involve volunteers in your work? Why do we even bother? This is not a rhetorical question. I want to hear some answers. Okay, here. We don't have enough staff. Resources are limited. We need help to get the work done. Back there. That was what you were going to say? Right, not enough finances. Yep. You want the community engagement. You want them to feel part of your organization. Okay. Yeah, a personal need. People want to help. And what do you want to get out of the volunteers? Like, what all do you need from them? Sorry, raise your hand. I can't hear everyone's mumbling. What was that? Advocacy for what you do. Okay. Reliability. That's a great one. Yeah, you want to be sure you can count on them, that they're going to show up when they say they're going to show up. Okay. Follow instructions. Good one. Yep. Right. They're passionate enough to come in for the first time and donate their time. They're donors. Anything else? Yes. They need to feel valued. Absolutely. And you actually transitioned me over to this. So volunteers need those things. We need their help. But and I want you to tell me a little bit about what's scary or hard about it then. What's holding you back from you? We know people are passionate. We know they want to do great work. We want them to be reliable. What's a little bit scary about inviting volunteers into your organizations? Liability. Different pages. Yeah, maybe they don't understand the work, or they don't have the same philosophy that you do about the work. Okay. Yeah. Oh. Sorry, go ahead. They might tell? Wait, what do you mean by they might tell? I see. Okay, because they're like members of the public, they might tell the public what they're seeing in the agency. Okay. And then Beth. Opening up, yeah. There's that scary feeling of you're letting the public in, and this work is difficult. So what I think a lot of times we really want to do with volunteer programs is kind of weigh the benefits with the risks, right? And it takes some investment. But ideally, if you're investing in the pieces of a program and the things that will help volunteers thrive, you can ideally minimize some of those risks or the problems that start to come up when you're engaging the public in the work. And is this volume okay, by the way? I feel like I'm doing this. Okay. So how do we get there? What's our secret sauce for this? And I surround this around kind of 10 key pieces. And it may sound daunting, but a lot of this is super easy. So don't let this 10 list overwhelm you, because we're going to kind of walk through each of these things. But the reason why I feel like that building some infrastructure or kind of creating that roadmap for your volunteer program is so key is similarly for the reasons I experienced when I volunteered, but even for organizations that have a lot of volunteers already engaged. it can become this kind of crisis, what we call the crisis chaos spiral, where either you're recruiting volunteers who maybe aren't right for the program, or they're finding out about the program because there's not a lot of infrastructure. There may not be a lot of training or guidance or support. Staff end up then spending time hand-holding them, like dealing with problems, so your staff get frustrated, and then the good volunteers get frustrated and leave. Sometimes the bad ones don't leave, which is worse. And then you end up right back over again, right? How many have experienced this? Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, so my goal today is to help you get a few pieces in your mind that you might be able to implement fairly easily in your own organization. So I want to share a few bits from the study that I did with Dr. Stephen Rogelberg at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. It was published about 5 years ago, and we surveyed animal shelters in a variety of ways in the United States. And a few of the significant findings were that we had, well, first, actually, let me back up. What we did was we actually had, we did the research from the perspective of staff. What is staff's view of volunteers, and what impact does that have on the organization? And what factors, make either staff love volunteers more or hate volunteers more? And we found in our study that lower ratings of volunteers by paid staff equated with less commitment and more likelihood of staff to quit the organization. So what that means is if staff had a low rating of volunteers, or felt like, based on that kind of crisis spiral, like volunteers are kind of a pain in my side, they're getting in my way, or they're running amok, they actually, not only does it impact your volunteer program and you don't have a good structure for your volunteer program, but it actually made it more likely that staff were going to leave the organization. And I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind, because volunteer programs aren't just kind of an add-on or a side thing. They're integral to the entire operation. And when it's not going well, the impacts can be very significant. The benefits are tremendous and wonderful when it's right and when it works. But I think this is pretty important to keep in mind. The good news is, when staff had a positive experience with, or they had a positive thoughts about volunteers, their commitment to the organization and their intent to quit was greatly reduced. And that of those 10 things I showed you, which we're going to kind of run through, the more best practices that an organization has in place, whether it's training, orientation, recognition for volunteers, the more of those pieces you have in place, the higher the staff's rating of volunteers goes. Does that make sense? So basically, the nutshell, I'm telling it to you in a very long-winded way apparently, is the more structure and path you build for a volunteer program, the greater commitment by your staff, lower intentions to quit, and greater volunteer retention. It's pretty common sense, but one of the key takeaways for me was really recognizing it can really damage an organization when it's not done well. So I want to run through quickly, because I know we don't have much time today. This is like a topic I could talk about for 10 years. So we're just going to run through these 10 pieces. First, who's in charge of the volunteer program? How many of you are fortunate to have a paid volunteer manager at your organization? Quite a few of you. That's fantastic. Okay, that's great. I know a lot of, how many aren't so lucky? All the rest of you, right? And that's a challenge to try and fit that in with everything else. But at least having some structure and leadership around who is taking responsibility and how the program's going to go is really key. And who is doing the volunteer coordinating is pretty important too. We want people, right? If we're going to be engaging people, having my experience with someone looking at me like I'm crazy is not going to help you keep your volunteers. So it's pretty common sense. And the volunteer manager's job, whether they're your full-time volunteer manager, as a lot of you are lucky to have, or you're squeezing it in amongst a million other things, or if it's a volunteer themselves. Volunteers can be the volunteer manager. I've done it. It can be done. Then they have some responsibilities to help put these pieces in place, but it's also incumbent upon the leadership of the organization to really set that tone and make the commitment that we're going to engage the public, engage the volunteers, and set that as an expectation throughout the organization. And that it can't be the volunteer coordinator, volunteer manager all by themselves in this separate little island trying to run the program. I see some really nodding heads right there. Some people have probably dealt with this. And I think secondarily, as you're either looking to kind of improve your volunteer program or deal with, maybe even create a new one, I think it's really important to stop and think about, why are you actually doing that? Why are you incorporating the volunteers? What do you need? And if you already have volunteers, it's okay still to kind of push the pause button. If things aren't going really smoothly for you, you could always push the pause button. The volunteers who are with you right now, stay with you, but you don't have to recruit more volunteers while you stop and kind of get some of these pieces in place so that you can then begin to move on a better track forward. But stopping and talking, not just you in a room, but sitting down, ask current volunteers, talk to your staff, like what's working, what do you want to get out of the program? What does it look like if you're successful with your volunteer program? It's not just people coming in and walking dogs. It certainly can be, but it can be so much more than that. So it's a key to think about, what all does your organization need? Maybe it's some of these simple things, feeding walking dogs, like I said, or doing fundraising, doing adoptions. Or it could be what John Cicerelli was talking about. I mean, not John Cicerelli, Todd Stussy. Sorry, John. You said wonderful things, but I meant Todd. Todd, when he was talking about the Granny Squad, I lit up when I heard about his Granny Squad. Like, that to me is the perfect, that shows a really well-structured volunteer program. The fact that he was able to pull in all these women, but you remember what he talked about, which you'll see in my presentation, is he had structure. Remember, he had like the orientation, he took them in the field and did training, he didn't abandon them, they became part of the staff, right? And so in my view, I really see volunteers as unpaid staff. And so I think they should, in some respects, be treated that way. And I also think we should treat our staffs a little more like volunteers and give them the recognition, praise, and joys that they should get as well, that the volunteers experience. So that's my little soapbox. All right, number 3 is culture and roles of the volunteers. What are you inviting them into? And by what are you inviting them into, I don't necessarily mean the physical space, although that's part of it. But what's the culture like in your organization? Are they going to experience some rude staff who maybe don't even mean to be rude? They're just really busy and they can't stop and answer every question that little volunteer has about this one cute kitten they saw. So, you have to manage expectations for people. And, but being mindful and aware that maybe your organization does have some of those interpersonal challenges, and which we all do. And if you do have that being aware of that and mindful of what volunteers can thrive in that environment, at least as you continue to improve that program, can really help. How are volunteers valued by the organization? And what boundaries are important? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, so I won't go into it here. But in terms of like what you're needing with volunteers, I kind of see it as really 3 levels. You can have the no skills needed. For the most part, you can come in and lick envelopes, right? Does anyone still lick envelopes? But if you like something simple that requires no training or anything, obviously super easy, get a group of people in to do something and move on. Then there could be another level where there is some training required, and then more of your highly specialized or skilled volunteers doing much more in-depth things like maybe adoption counseling or Granny Squad. So you need to be able to like tier your programs. And I used that picture yesterday. I didn't mean to use it twice. But finding the right people, figuring out who is it that you're looking for in your program, and being clear about what you want. I always like to say you need a volunteer for every job, not a job for every person who wants to volunteer. And that's hard for people to hear because I think a lot of folks don't want to turn anyone away. But again, if you're designing your program, it's supposed to be beneficial to your organization and supporting the work that you do. Sometimes having more volunteers than you need actually hinders your effectiveness. So I would rather have 10 really well-trained, fabulous volunteers than 20 mediocre ones. Screen in people, screen out people. How many of you actually do screen volunteers before you take them into your program? Some of you. All right. Good for you. More of you will do it after this. So you need to think about for your organization who is the right fit. And this will be variant depending on your own organization. It's not going to be the same for every place. Based on your culture, based on the work that you need done. Who's that when you think about if we only had this kind of person? That's okay. Think of that person and then go find them, rather than just opening the door and allowing everyone to filter through. Think about what your deal breakers are when it comes to volunteers. And there should be some parameters around it, just like you have with staff, right? I mean, you have some guidelines. We have a playbook we all have to play by, whether it's written down or it's just known. What must you see in volunteers? If Sally has volunteered or signed up to volunteer, but she missed her time 5 weeks in a row, what does that say to the organization? What happens with Sally? Does everyone just go, well, she's just a volunteer, and they move on? Or does someone say, hey, Sally, we were really counting on you. Your role and position here in the organization is valuable, and by you not showing up when you told us you were going to show up, created all these other problems down the line. You know, if you're going to volunteer here, we really need to have some commitment. How can we work together to fix it? Very different approaches to dealing with volunteers, and has a very different result. What is absolutely not okay in terms of in your organization when it comes to volunteers? Maybe volunteers aren't allowed in a euthanasia room. Or, you know, or maybe volunteers can't handle dogs in a quarantine area. Fine. Just make those very clear and try to think about in advance what the rule book is. And what are your expectations for their participation, as I was talking about. And so thinking through, too, what the process looks like when you have to address an issue with a volunteer. How many of you had to fire a volunteer? Yeah. It's not fun, but sometimes you have to do that. So in my book, it's sort of like, at least not, hopefully not firing volunteers, but dealing with a problem. It's going to happen. We're all human beings. People make mistakes, things go wrong. But think about, what does that look like? And some of the tools that we're providing will help minimize those problems, and they'll also give you some tools to help address it. And now that I'm looking at this, I kind of wish I'd done this in a different order, because I think this would be helpful later. But for example, and I'll talk about these things in a moment, if you're screening in someone, you know, you're bringing someone on, they get some training, and you're working with them and having a volunteer agreement, which I'll talk about in a moment. When you have those few steps in place, addressing a problem with a volunteer gets a lot easier, because it's really clear what you've told them up front, what kind of the rules are, and then it's kind of up to them whether or not they're following the rules. If they're not, that gives you a pretty easy thing to sit down and go, like, here's all the ways we've already covered this, and you're not staying coloring within the lines. We've got to fix this, or it's not going to work out. But think about if you have none of those pieces in place. How do you sit down and tell someone they've made a mistake, or that they're not following the rules? So it becomes really important to be transparent and clear about what that looks like. Protocols, in terms of what needs to get done and when. Setting up a volunteer schedule. And which activities are off limits for volunteers? Are there any? Maybe they're not. In some groups, that's fine. And I feel like I'm sharing with you all these kind of nuts and bolts pieces, but I want to be really clear that I think and challenge you to think about volunteers' really big picture. And in my view, there are very few things volunteers can't do in pretty much any organization. So if you're immediately thinking, oh, I don't want volunteers doing this, I don't want volunteers doing that, maybe you start small, and volunteers can only right now do these few things. But as you build infrastructure of the program, you start to get confidence about it. Man, volunteers can help you in so many aspects of your operation you haven't even thought about. I mean, think about Todd's team. When they thought about sending the Granny Squad out, it probably caused heart attacks at first, right? But now they're so amazing, and they're doing all this incredible work in the community that his staff could never do. And because they're members of the public, kind of getting to your point over there about telling, like, because they're members of the public, sometimes in the public, they carry a lot more credibility than you. Because they're a volunteer. They're not being paid by your organization. So when they go out and they do engage really well with the public and they love your organization, it's tremendously powerful. So how many of you have volunteer agreements? A few of you. Good. Okay. I really like them, and they don't have to be real legalese, and they don't have to be, I would be careful about your wording of them. But I like being able to lay out, here's what, it's almost like, maybe I should change this, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I should change it to written expectation instead of agreement, because agreement sounds so legalese. But I like to be able to kind of lay out the expectation, like, here's kind of what we expect from our volunteers, and here's what we need to be able to count on you. We want everyone to play together as a team, whatever it is, written very friendly. And then also, though, have a section on that same agreement or expectations document that says, here's what you can expect from us, and here's what we are promising to do for you. that when you come in, you'll be treated respectfully and that your scheduled times will be available for you, that we'll provide you with the training and information you need in order to do a really good job with us, and that we'll give you the supplies and stuff to make yourself successful, whatever that looks like. I really like being able to kind of lay that out and having us both sign it, because it sort of says, it's a relationship you're creating. And when there's a problem later on, it gives you a tool to kind of use to address issues when there are some. So training. When do you do training? How do you do training? And it's going to, again, vary by organizations. I know a lot of shelters who will their first training is actually just an orientation, and you don't even have to have signed up to be a volunteer yet. You can just come, kind of like an informational meeting. You can come learn about the organization, and during that meeting, I love those because it's a great opportunity for you to kind of share some information about your organization, and also a great opportunity for volunteers before they sign up with you to see if it's the right fit for them. And in that, you can share with them, here's some of the things to expect, here's some of what we do and what we don't do, so that there aren't surprises, right, later on. And that maybe they will learn that, well, that sounds like it's not going to be a great fit for me, and that's okay, because you don't want to invest a lot of time in screening people, training, and doing all that, only to have a volunteer decide later that it's not good for them. So I love those opportunities. And then when someone comes on, is everyone getting kind of at least the baseline training, what you need everyone to know, and then base your other trainings on whatever the role is that volunteer is being assigned. I think that's critically important. So I just mentioned the orientations and training specifically for positions. So for example, if you do have dog walkers, their training's going to look pretty different than an adoption counselor. And maybe there's a level. Maybe you have to be a dog walker for so long before you become an adoptions counselor so that you can get more familiar with the organization. So being able to think that through ahead of time, or even now, stopping and putting it into place is a great thing to do. And I can tell you, if you don't have these pieces now, you can always start implementing them now with your existing volunteers. But here's part of how I would suggest doing that too, is engaging the volunteers in that process. Like I found with organizations, maybe they didn't really clarify the roles. I mean, the dog workers come in and do their thing, but they didn't have it written down. I didn't mean to do that. So they didn't have it written down. Ask the volunteer. Have a meeting with your volunteers and say, look, we want to help build some structure so that we have the foundation laid so we can bring in more amazing people like you to help us do this work. As a result, here's some tools we want to put into place. Can you, Johnny, who does dog walking every day, can you kind of help us craft out, or at least sit down with me for 10 minutes and tell me about what does it take to be a dog walker here? What are the things a volunteer should know? And kind of craft out almost like a position description for what it is to be a dog walker in your organization. Because I'll tell you down the line, when you want to recruit volunteers and you know how many of those you need, it makes your recruitment so much easier to be able to go out and say, here's exactly what you should expect as a dog walker. Here's the kind of person we're looking for, and ready to go, rather than just blanketly asking for people to walk dogs. And what do your staff need to know? There has to be an expectation set. There is sometimes resistance. How many folks have had some resistance with staff and volunteers? Yeah, especially in a busy shelter, I can understand that. I know that I was kind of a pain in the ass for those staff when I came in and said, okay, I'll clean your raccoon cage, but wait, I don't know where the hose is. Wait, where's the detergent? Do I need to wear gloves? So that was a pain for them. But again, if some pieces are simply put into place and I'm trained on site, then I can be washing all those raccoon cages for the next month and they don't have to touch it, right? So it's sort of investing in that longer term support and help you're going to get out of it. But I think there has to be an expectation set from the top that staff will at least, at a minimum, be professional and polite with volunteers. I think really you should, moving forward, include that in job descriptions for staff, that part of working here is working collaboratively with volunteers. And that is important to this organization. It's amazing how much that can help set the tone. And also, though, try to troubleshoot. Why do staff have concerns? What's causing hiccups along the way? And see if there are things you can do to make it easier for staff to work with volunteers. Oh, and the help with what's in it for them. I really love that because I think that is key for staff. Like, they don't want to see it as a burden, or you don't want them to see it as a burden. So part of it is also asking them, what are they looking for? And Some of the volunteer managers I've worked before, I've had a lot of luck, just like if there's, usually you have like one or two really stellar volunteers, right? That person probably just popped into your mind. Like there's that one person who would just do anything for the organization, and the staff love that person. So if you go to your staff and say, you know what, Mary, what if, close your eyes for a second and picture, what if I could find you 10 Marys? They would be as good as Mary, they'd be as committed as Mary, they would help you like Mary does. What does that look like for you? What do you need help with, right? Because again, a lot of it comes down to who are you recruiting and how. And if staff feel like they're going to be able to lay out with you, or the volunteer manager, or whoever is kind of helping to lead this, what they really could use and feel trusting that you're gonna help recruit the right people can make all the difference. So waivers and release of liability, I know it's not as big of an issue here, it sounds like quite as much maybe as in the US, but sometimes it's just a simple, I think this varies again by organization, and government has different restrictions. But it's important to at least check on it. What kind of insurance coverage do you have if a volunteer is injured? What's the protocol if someone's, say, bitten by a dog, or even if they just fall, let's say they slip on the kennel floor? What does that look like? A lot of organizations in the United States do have like liability waivers, and as Todd said, it can help, certainly help, but people still, at least in the US, can sue you for anything. But if you have, I think when you have all the pieces to a program better structured and put into place, it really helps to insulate the organization from the liability. Okay. And lastly, culture of appreciation. You know, it's, in my mind, it's not enough just to send out an e-newsletter and say, thanks, volunteers. I think that's wonderful, and I think that should be part of it. But like with everyone, and somebody had in their presentation earlier, I think it was Cynthia, about what that most satisfaction for an individual is, of feeling like they have some autonomy and ability to make a difference. I think that is key with volunteers as well. And I think the more specific your recognition can be, and sometimes it's just as simple as saying, hey, you know, John, I saw the way you talked and helped that lady look for a cat in the cat room. That was awesome. Thank you so much. That goes a really long way. I also find it helps a lot if you can help bring staff and volunteers together and have them kind of recognize each other. It can help lessen the divide between like your volunteers, your staff, and help start building more of that team approach. And do volunteers have a voice? Like, and what does that look like? How are you getting feedback from them, and how is that being taken into account when you're making tweaks to the program? So a couple of things is, when it comes to volunteer management, it's not about just a bunch of warm bodies. Ask for what you want. If you need someone to do something kind of crazy, figure that out and ask for it. Find someone specific. I mean, even down to if you have some repairs that need to be made on your facility, reach out to the construction companies in your area. And that's a bad example, but you get what I mean. Success depends on monitoring and course correction. And by that, I just mean keeping tabs on what's going on. Don't just build, I mean, you can build it and they will come, as the previous speaker said, but that's not the end, right? It's an ongoing keeping tabs and addressing little things that come up here and there to ensure everything keeps running smoothly down the tracks. But most importantly, volunteers are supposed to add to your organization and not take away from it. They shouldn't be a burden. They should be a huge help to you. And so I've just kind of thrown a lot at you in 30 minutes. This is like supposed to be 3 hours. But I guess my biggest suggestion would be just start small. Every little piece you can start building in towards creating that road path, or the road map, I should say, for your program, the better off it will be down the line. And good news is you do not have to reinvent the wheel. Everything I just talked about and more is available to you online. There's a lot of information out there. Animalsheltering.org, which is our Humane Society of the United States website for the sheltering profession. If you go to that website and you just go to /volunteer management, there's a ton of great resources up there. But there were also, and I don't think I included here, okay, I didn't. Here, I'll go back to that in case you want to write that down. But there are a couple of other things that I would like to mention if I have time. Yes, okay, I have a couple minutes. So 2 things. One is there's an organization in the United States called Energize Inc., I-N-C. And they have a website. I think it's just energizeinc.com or .org. in the US, they're an organization devoted to helping all kinds of organizations engage volunteers. They have a really great website, and they have all kinds of information. And Susan Ellis, who runs it, has, and I think it's even downloadable on her site, something called a volunteer audit. It's like a volunteer management audit. And it's a book that helps you walk through making improvements to your volunteer programs. It allows you, it's an audit, basically, a self-done audit of your volunteer program, all the different pieces you need, how you can fix things. So I would advise you to check that out. It's a great resource. And another thing, and I thought I had it in here. I'm so bummed I didn't put it in here. But I think you'll find out that site, or you can email me. I'll have my cards here for you. We have partnered as part of the organization, University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who I did the research with. After we did that research, we developed a volunteer program assessment tool. And they have been administrating it now for about 5 years to hundreds of shelters in the United States. And what it does, allows you, if you were to take part of this, and you can, I double checked with him before I came here to make sure Australian organizations could do it. He said, sure, he'd love to. It's all done over email anyway, or it's electronic. He provides an electronic survey that goes out, you can send out to all your volunteers, and asks a variety of questions about their level of commitment, what pieces are involved in the program, blah, 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 where they see issues. And they each get, it's an anonymous link, so they collect all of the responses back, they analyze it, and then they have someone walk through it with you and help you point out some things that you can do to improve your program. So it's a great way to get free help and some feedback from your volunteers directly and help you better engage in solve any issues that might be cropping up. So I would encourage you to take advantage of that if you are having some issues with your volunteer program. I think there is a link to it. I hope so. I'm going to check after, and if it's not there, I'll make sure it gets added on that webpage. Okay? I think that kind of covers really fast a few nuts and bolts. Hope that's helpful, and I'm happy to answer questions after the next speaker. Thanks, guys.